So, Christopher, welcome to the Black and Raw podcast. It's really good to have you on.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking time to interview me. This is rare coming from London, obviously, or England. So I'm looking forward to it.
So yeah, no, brilliant. Thank you for coming on. And when we talked before, you had told me about this expansive career that you've had, from developing technologies with the police to writing about covert government activities, very wide ranging. And some of the other stuff that you're doing now, where you said you like to do photography and things. So a man of many talents. And I just wanted to ask if you can share more about your journey, and just, I guess, what led you to transitioning from working with police technologies to now becoming an author?
It's always about truth, and when you find the truth, you sort of have to expose it, regardless of the consequences. So, sort of what led me on this path, it really started back in the '60s and early '70s. That when you experience something that's detrimental to your fellow human being, it sort of weighs on you as a responsibility to expose that. Maybe not now, maybe later, but to expose it regardless. And that's sort of what drove me to write the book, expose various things. In fact, that was a motivation to begin to work with law enforcement because I had seen the bad side. And my goal was to find the good side because there's always two sides.
Yeah, definitely. And can you elaborate on sort of what that was transformative for you that you experienced?
Yeah, so when someone is stopped on the street, as you and I probably have been numerous times because of who we are, there's an element of danger involved, both to us and the police officer. That's existed for years. I worked with creating a technology that would not only protect the police officer, but also protect the citizen. So I'll give you an example. You get stopped for running a stop sign. Police officer approaches you with his hand on his gun. Very threatening position. You make one wrong move and you could catch a bullet. The technology we created predicted the stop before it happened. So before the officer gets out of his car, he knows quite a bit about you. He knows you're not wanted for first degree murder. He knows you don't have any wants or warrants. He knows it's a safe approach. He can take his hand off his gun and he can act with respect towards you. That's what our technology created. And it was so precise that it actually voiced back the information to the officer. If there was a danger involved, he was instructed to call backup immediately to create a safer situation for the citizen. Today, probably 6,000 police departments use this technology to avoid danger to both citizens and officers. So I'm quite proud of that portion of my career where I was able to implement that and change people's lives and actually save lives.
Yeah, I that's really awesome because I think, as you were saying, a police officer approaching you with one hand already on his gun, anything can happen. We've seen lots of incidences of things happening, haven't we? And I think for a police officer to sort of have that information before, we can sort of be naive and be like, oh, they should treat everybody the same. But I think when you're in a situation, when you're an officer in general, you've been in a lot of situations where things can turn sideways very quickly. So I feel like you're probably more, I don't know if aware is it, or just more heightened to what is that something can happen. So I think having a technology like that, as you're saying, safer for the officers, but also safer for the people.
Well, and consider this also, if you're an officer on the street, you sort of have one thing in mind when dealing with criminals, and that is going home tonight to your family.
Mm.
And it's kind of the attitude of police officers, whatever it takes, including shooting you to assure that I go home at night, even if you don't. So this is an attitude among police officers that needs to be neutralized. And I think the technology really helped neutralize that because, it is a tough job, let's face it. Not one that I would want. I mean, I don't know what's equivalent. Airline pilot, plane might crash. These guys
Mm.
might not come home at night on a daily basis, much more frequently than planes crash.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess we never really sort of think about that aspect of it, isn't it? We always just sort of see police have shot a black person, police have done this, police have done that. But, and don't get me wrong, those things are awful in terms of what's happening, but we never sort of humanize the person behind it. It's sort of just an officer. It's just someone, that wears blue. We don't often think about, they've got kids which they want to go home and see. They might be
Yes.
terrified going up to a car because it could be the last time they took their kids to school this morning or the last time they put their kids to bed yesterday. So yeah, there is a lot of fear also within that aspect too.
Yeah, and then to emphasize also here in the States, that type of incident of officers being killed was at an all-time high last year and the year before. So it is heightened. And you and I think about that activity and just think about it in our minds every day, approaching strange cars at 1 o'clock in the morning. It's not a pleasant thought.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I remember I talked to somebody recently actually that was in Detroit, and he told me we were talking about the Detroit riots. And I know that's something in your books in which you've mentioned, and which you've sort of explored. But then there's also other things within Detroit that you've explored. Can you just further elaborate on that for me in terms of the experience of people in Detroit?
Yeah, and let me give you just a real quick historical background on sort of the development of this industrialized city. And as you know, it's the motor capital of the world. It used to be, I should say, until everybody started producing cars. We were once the motor capital of the world, so we produced more automobiles there than any place in the world. So how this happened was that there was a mass migration of people from the south to the north in order to seek these jobs, which were labor jobs in factories. Didn't require much education or background. In fact, you could graduate from high school next day, walk into a factory, and you could get a job. So jobs were very plentiful, and that meant economic. The economic engine of Detroit was very plentiful as far as people buying homes and cars, sending their kids to college, things like this. But also, the migration included many whites as well, not just blacks. So what you've got in Detroit back in the 50s and 60s are transplanted people from the South. So the South, regardless of race, came north. So you had a lot of racism that traveled north as well. There's been this allegation over the years that the city of Detroit is so run down now. It looks like Beirut, Lebanon, after a bombing, or I should say Gaza at this point, that this was done by the people who lived there because they were lazy and shiftless. But now, if we really look at history and we look at World War II and how the factories converted to making weapons and how all these cars were built, this was African American people doing this. They're the ones who built the automobile industry. Something happened in that city to turn it around. And that event was the 67 riot, where over 1,000 buildings were burned to the ground. It transformed the city almost overnight. The city was never the same after that. The racial attitudes were intensified after that. And so we found a lot of changes in Detroit that they were bad. In other words, businesses moved out, homes were abandoned. There was something called white flight, where people fled across the famous street called 8 Mile into the suburbs away from the Black communities. This all happened after the riot. Police brutality caused the riots. People think it was something else. History's been written wrong on that. But it was police brutality. It was throw down guns. It was harassment. It was an assault on the Black community by special units of the Detroit Police Department. There were throw down guns where people were shot and killed in the street for no reason but the sport of killing someone. So these officers, remember, they came from the South. And the way they were sort of framed in the minds of Black people was the new Ku Klux Klan, except they were in police cars and they weren't wearing capes. They were very intimidating to Black people. So anyone who lived there during that era can testify to this. There was a lot of problems. I mean, we had the highest rate of murder by police officers of any city in the country. That was Detroit. 20% of those people killed were under 20 years old. They were unarmed 93% of the time. So it was a bloodbath by the police department.
Mm, damn. So when you hear it in person, well, not in person, but when you're listening to it, it's it's kind of harrowing, really, isn't it? And it's quite saddening that a city which, as you were saying, was once made the most cars in the world, you would think, oh, a city like that should prosper, right? There should be wealth that probably still stays within that city. Cars are still being made, and a place that was world renowned for it should have most expertise in it as well. But when you hear about that, you then maybe understand why Detroit is maybe the place it is now and the history
Yes.
that it's been through.
Well, what happened just after this riot, you could just about count 6 to 9 months. There was a tremendous influx of drugs into the city. And by drugs, I'm talking about heroin and cocaine. When I say almost overnight, I mean, I'm just saying this as an in-person witness to what happened to the city. My closest friends who I went to school with became drug dealers, low-level retail drug dealers on the street. Drugs were plentifully available anywhere you went in Detroit in the Black community. I mentioned one incident in the book where I actually was so outraged by the police department being less than a block away from a drug corner that I got out of my car and I approached the police officer and I said, "Don't you see that? That's drug dealing going down right there within 500 feet of you." They told me to move on and mind my own business. So I became the enemy. They were protecting the drug dealers. So probably half the Detroit Police Department was on the tape. It's all documented in the book. The names are there of the police officers. They even recruited the members of the police department to become drug dealers. So they were both taxpayer funded and funded by drug dealers. They would rob drug houses and they would sell the drugs from the drug houses. They would rob drug houses and confiscate the drugs and sell them to another drug dealer. These officers, one was a sergeant, and you'll read about that in the book, became a millionaire off this, all funded by
Wow.
tax dollars in the city of Detroit. The tragic thing about all this, it was basically swept under the rug. People didn't want to talk about it. It came out in the newspapers because there was investigations, but people basically didn't want to talk about this. But believe me, there's thousands of bodies buried under the city of Detroit right now as a result of this drug attack. Ultimately, as you'll read, it was fueled by the CIA, allowing these drugs to come through customs into the country, escorted to major cities throughout the country. Detroit was a target because of this riot and how extensive the riot was. This was a fire, a fuse that they lit, and they intended to put it out forever. Generationally, drugs still have an effect on the city. Going back to that wealth we talked about, Detroit was known as a city of homes. So obviously, if you're making a great wage in a factory, you're working overtime. Some people were doing double shifts. In that day and age, they were making quite a bit of money. They were making as much money as professional people did. And they were buying homes. Those homes are now in ruins now. And if we just want to reverse the situation, let's just say that this didn't happen. Those pieces of real estate, probably trillions of dollars worth of real estate, would have been transferred to the next generation, but it's evaporated. And the people in Detroit have to start all over again. In the book also, I compare Greenwood, Oklahoma, which was Black Wall Street. I compare that to Detroit for a very good reason. If you read the story of Greenwood, you know that they dropped bombs on the people of Greenwood. They never got a penny for the damages. Detroit is the same way. They damaged the city with drugs. Nobody ever recovered a penny for the damage that was done. Granted, people are going to say, and I've received this sort of soft hate mail that says, though the people shouldn't have used the drugs, that it's their fault. Well, my response to that is the drugs shouldn't have been there in the first place for them to use. So we have to look at the supplier. And yes, the drug users have a responsibility. They shouldn't have been doing that. But what about the people who put it in front of them and made it tempting and made it possible for drug dealers to make all this money, including members of the police department? Who did that? Where's the price to be paid for that? We know the people who shouldn't have used the drugs, they paid the price. They're dead now. And generations still have those drugs in them. After this attack came the crack attack. So it's been there. There's been damage done. And if you read in the beginning of my book, I talk about the drug companies who put the opioids into white communities. There's billions being paid to those people, billions. And over the next 9 years, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's billions of dollars by 3 companies who have to compensate the victims for what they did. Granted, that was a private company. It was Pfizer and some other companies. Well, this was a private company too, called the CIA, with the support of the US government, designed to destroy the Black community, destroy freedom of speech. Our book is all about people speaking up about this and how they were crushed and sort of told to be quiet or else. That's the basic theme of the book.
Damn. Yeah, I remember I watched this TV show called Snowfall, and it was about CIA bringing crack into the hood. Great show. Desmond Idris, Damien Idris, great actor. But it was watching that, and then also hearing what you're telling me, like you can see the parallels in it, and it's such a shame that you're dealing with you're dealing with the CIA, mate. These guys will go and assassinate people, will go and assassinate presidents. Like you're dealing with a monolith of just the government and a secret society to a certain extent. And it's just a shame that these instances were brought upon Black people. And I hear you when people are like, "Oh, people shouldn't do drugs," and this and that. Listen,
Yeah.
drugs are going to be done, drugs are going to be there. But I guess the situation in which if the Detroit riots didn't take place, if there wasn't the environment that led to the riots taking place, as you were saying, a lot of these Black people would have built intergenerational wealth. They would have built stable homes. They would have had family members who stayed around and grew up to raise up the next generation. The likelihood is they wouldn't even need to take drugs because there was nothing for them to escape away from. But
Yes.
when all of this has happened and people are then left vulnerable and with no hope, then yeah, you're going to go and take something that relieves your pain, that relieves the stresses of the world upon you.
And so the residual, what comes from drugs? Prostitution, theft, breaking and entering, people stealing from their own families, their mothers. That's what was going on in Detroit. So what does that do to a community? It divides families? Of course it does. Obviously, when the person is buried in the ground, that destroys a family as well. It leaves children fatherless and vice versa, motherless. That's the real effect of these drugs. And it's very simplistic to see that this is one of the greatest weapons of all time to use against Black people because we lost the drug war in Detroit. The drugs won. No question about it. The drugs won. They called it a war on drugs. It was a war on people. That's exactly what it was.
Mm. Yeah, Americans like to, well, the American government like to say a war on something, when really it's a war on something different. The war on terror was a way of committing genocides, but we're not going to get into that one anyway. But in terms of you writing this book, as you were saying, it's sort of telling the story and bringing to light what the CIA and the FBI and the government have been doing in Detroit. Um, you wrote this in a first person sort of point of view. So I wanted to understand, I guess, the significance of writing in this style. And how can, I guess, as a reader, how does it help us relate more to the story?
Yeah, very good question. I wanted people to see what government policy does to people and their lives. So I wanted people to be interactive with the policy and the impact of what was going on. So they actually see. So I didn't want to do a documentary, obviously, because facts and figures bore people, but I wanted them to see this is what happens when evil exists and it's allowed to flourish and it's backed by racism. Here's the result in people's lives on a daily basis. It not only has an immediate effect, it's got a long-term effect. So that's why I sort of wrote it in that third person way so people could follow the path of where all this was leading and they see the damages along the way. And really, not just the Black people. As you read the book, you'll see at the end, there were two revenge murders. There were two killers who did a revenge murder on a campus in Michigan State. This is all fueled by racism. When we become what our enemy is, we become as bad as our enemy. And that's one of the things that happened in the book.
So what were these when you said they were revenge murders? So what these were black people that went and I get got revenge. Was it simple as that? Was it for what had happened?
Pretty much as simple as that. They were actually exposing the truth. And what happened was the government stepped in and they committed some murders of four people who were very good friends of the two killers. The killers responded by going to a campus and randomly picking out a person to kill. And they stabbed him 10 times and he died. They were eventually caught and tried for murder. But it's quite a path from A to B to Z, because between the time they were caught, 35 years later, by the way, one of them became a millionaire, the other became homeless, a homeless drug user. Two opposite directions. They were both arrested from cold case monies that the federal government provided the city of Lansing. So these cold case dollars said, well, pick a case. Well, they picked that case because they actually arrested these guys and let them go because Miranda rights weren't read properly. So they were free for 30 something years.
Wow.
Finally caught up with them in two different lifestyles, absolutely. The person that became a millionaire was in Henderson, Nevada, had developed a real estate firm, and it flourished. And he was a millionaire. In fact, as you read in the book, he concocted a scheme, murder for hire scheme, while he was in jail to pay an inmate to kill the other guy. So he was the one who
What?
did this stabbing. Yeah, yeah, it's in the book. It's murder for hire. He wanted to pay somebody $12,000 to kill that guy so he can't testify against me in court, but it didn't work. They both ended up in jail with long sentences.
Wow, that's kind of
Yes.
crazy. That's a
Well, it
very
just shows you that that's what hate does. Hate
mm,
begets hate, and they turned into the same animals as the racists, and they became them. And then that took control of them. Anger, hate, fear, all combined. They picked a kid just walking home to his dorm and chopped him up.
mm. So what would you say in terms of for people reading this book? How do you want it to impact those that are listening and those that live in Detroit? Yeah.
Yeah. So here's what I want people to really get from this book after they read it. And two separate questions on that. You asked about the people in Detroit. That's a separate issue, and I'll address that second. What I want them to get from this book is not to believe the history that they've been fed, because it's designed to make them look bad, and it works. We look bad in general in the history of this nation. We look bad. We're not given credit for anything, but we're charged with everything. Everything bad is attached to somebody black. If you really look at your history, if you look at their history, George Washington, Washington, D.C., it's an insult. It's almost like Jewish kids going to Hitler High School. We have stuff named after slaveholders in this country, people who had slaves in their backyard like chickens and pigs. Yet we named the nation's capital after that person. Even his wife had slaves. All these founding fathers had slaves. So how are we supposed to respect that kind of history when they judged us as animals? Now, that's not to say that we should hate them for it, but we should know the real history. Every time you look at a dollar bill or a $10 bill and we see that face on there, that's a slaveholder. One of the objections I've had over the years is the deconstruction of these slave holder statues, like Custer and a bunch of them around the country. They've been pulled down for the most part. I think that's a huge mistake. That's erasing history. The real answer to that would be to put a plaque underneath telling who they really were. So our people could go there and say, this guy held 300 slaves. This guy, George Washington, and his wife had slaves at Mount Vernon. In fact, you can go there right now and see the slave quarters, although they won't show it to you. You got to kind of wander off and find it. It's
Mm,
there. And the plaques are there. It's an exhibit where the slaves lived. But every time I've been on a tour, they don't take you there. They take you everything else but the slave quarters. They show you the slave cemetery, but not the slave quarters. So this is the guy who our capital is named after. Just think about that. Washington, D.C., named after the slaveholder, George Washington. I can't respect that. but I can't understand that. And from that understanding, I get new knowledge. So this is trying to get people to investigate what they've learned and sort of unlearn it and replace it with fact and truth. The people of Detroit, I have a separate mission for the people of Detroit who deserve reparations for this attack, just like Pfizer is giving reparations to the white kids who got hooked on opioids. Right now, there's a reparations committee in Detroit that's been formed. In fact, they meet next month, Black History Month, to decide which way we go on reparations. The committee was formed last year, but it was sort of disbanded and rebanded. So here's what they think Black people deserve reparations for. Redlining in real estate, being steered towards certain neighborhoods, yeah. Miseducation, yeah, the schools are very poor. But what about this drug attack? What about this devastating drug attack that destroyed all these homes and this real estate and businesses of Black people? What about that? That's what I'm presenting to them, all my evidence, and I very minor evidence in the book. I have just an enormous amount of newspaper articles, facts and figures that are fairly boring, but they're going to be given all that information and say, this is where you need to seek your reparations. Slavery's over, but this is modern history. This just happened 50 years ago, and we need to be compensated. No question.
Yeah. And I think people will hear that and be like, 50 years ago, like that wasn't long, but you could have someone that's alive right now that would have been through that. You would have had kids that would have been impacted by that. Like
Yes.
50 years ago, it's, I mean, people are living now until they're 90. That's
Yes.
50 years ago is not much.
Yes.
And I think reparations is always such an interesting topic, isn't it? Because some people are like,
Yes.
oh, we should get reparations for slavery. And they should give back more. They should give, like, someone's like, oh, the British Museum wouldn't be a museum anymore if we gave back all of the things that they've got in there, which I thought was
Yes.
quite funny. And I also, just to get you on that point of, instead of tearing them down, we should highlight what they were. I
Yes.
I think that's quite an interesting point, because I think some people would be like, no, just get rid of them. Like, it
Right.
doesn't serve us anymore. In England, there was one in Bristol during the Black Lives Matter protest. There's this dude, Edward Colston or something, major slave owner, lots of money from slavery. He's got streets named after him in Bristol. Even in Zimbabwe, there's things named after slave owners too. And they brought that down. And what was quite interesting is that they were going to be prosecuted for it. They went through a trial and everything, and I think they deemed them as non-guilty. But that was always quite an interesting sort of debate when it came up of like, do we keep these monuments to these people? I do wonder what putting showing their crimes on those plaques would do. I wonder how that would impact people instead of bringing them down, because would people just ignore it, or would people look at it and be like, maybe I should
Well,
question?
let me give you a real life example of what that does. If you ever get a chance to go to Philadelphia, where there's the Liberty Bell, and it's a tourist attraction, you know, the bell's got a crack in it, and that's a big deal. So you line up for the Liberty Bell, and sometimes it's 100 people deep. People walk by, they read the exhibit. But on the way to the Liberty Bell, what the community's done, they force the city to place the history of Philadelphia, which was our First Nations capital, by the way.
Oh.
Right there on the grounds where you could kind of compare it like the Capitol building or the White House, that area of Philadelphia. There's a big hole in the ground that you have to walk by as you're headed to the Liberty Bell. In the hole is where Black people used to be kept as slaves, in that big hole.
Oh.
So by the time I passed the hole, read everything about what was down there and how they were kept, you think I wanted to see the Liberty Bell? No. I got out of line. I said, that's enough for me. There's no Liberty Bell today. But that's the impact it can have when you tell the truth about history. And I actually have to credit the people of Philadelphia for having that done. It was very educational. I would have never known that was the case, but it's still there if you ever get to Philadelphia.
Wow. Yeah, no, I definitely do want to go to Philadelphia one time. now for that, but also, the Rocky stairs and stuff like that. Everyone wants to go
Yeah.
and a cheesesteak as well. I want to try a cheesesteak.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's quite harrowing that there was like, I mean, yeah, applaud to the people of Philadelphia, because being able to get a government, well, your guys' states are like small mini governments, aren't they? But getting the
Yes.
states to do that and to be like, okay, we're sort of gonna own up to our history. I don't know. Do you think America, and even for myself answering for Britain, do you think they're ready to account for their history, for their sins to a certain extent?
Well, it's a funny thing. The truth never dies. The truth can't be changed. I mean, even if you want it to be. I mean, taking down these statues is kind of benefit to white supremacy because now nobody's going to ever talk about it again. Why would they? They'd say, well, a statue used to be there, but it's not there anymore. And people are going to say, okay, well, so what? When it's there, and you can take your family there and they can learn about history. That's very important. So, yes, I think they'll have to come to grips with it. We haven't heard as much talk about the historical aspects of slavery than we have in the past 10 years. What
Mm.
happened since slavery? Nobody was talking about it. Now it's kind of coming to the surface and they can't deny it. They can't deny the racism, the supremacy, what they've done to people over the years. And you know what? The world knows it. The world knows it because it's been done all over the world with people of color. You go to India, it's the same thing. You go to Mexico, it's the same thing. Everywhere we've gone, we've misused people of color. So they're in the minority with that lie now. And now the truth is in the hands of the majority.
Yeah, definitely, but definitely. So I wanted to touch on your up and coming book. I loved the title, The Corporate Clan. And I guess in its aim to address white privilege, greed and racism, what sort of inspired you to delve into that topic? You sort of went for Killing Detroit. Now you're coming for the corporate clans.
Yes. From my experience in corporate America, I wrote this document to be released in the spring. It's very important that people understand that corporations are indeed governments. So let me give you an example. Governments have courts, governments have incarceration systems, they have ways of passing laws. Corporations are the same way. So, for you, example, let's say we want to do harm to you. We can't put you in jail. We're a corporation. We certainly can take away your income. We certainly can ruin your reputation. We can certainly make sure you never work anywhere where you can make a substantial income. We can label you any way we want. And who can do anything about it? Other employees who are dependent upon feeding their families are going to remain quiet. So 99.9% of the people employed, this is by survey, they won't speak up when they see wrong done in a corporation because of their job. They don't want to risk it. Corporations know that, and they set up HR departments to control everything that goes on in the corporation. So if they want racism to be overlooked, they do it. So these are tiny governments which are exposed in the corporate plan. It's an incident where, and I don't want to give away the end of the plot, but someone was grossly abused from a corporate perspective and made to look like an embezzler, a forger, and a thief. And they were all lies. It was a setup based on jealousy, based on this gentleman's hard work resulting in progress that people resented. So, who is this guy coming in here doing all this good work and making the company money? Who does he think he is? Lazy white people resented that. They resented that work ethic. And therefore, he was attacked and almost ruined. But he persevered. And as you'll read in the book, and I'm not going to give away the plot, he won. He won against Goliath.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite interesting. And I think as a society, corporations are becoming much bigger, much more powerful, and even sometimes to the level of governments, like, and holding governments to account. Or it's hard for them to be held to account by governments as well. So it's
Oh,
quite
yes.
an interesting, phase we're getting into, because soon Amazon is going to be too big to manage. Soon, maybe they already are. Facebook is too big to even try and manage, and Elon Musk has got two companies. So, these guys are going to soon become too big for governments to even rail in. So, how do we deal with what goes on with those systems? People are here, people in UK, people in the US, Amazon workers are striking, but sometimes their
Yeah.
voices don't get heard because it's like actually
You know,
happening.
you remind me of the time that I went to Washington, D.C. for the first time. I was fairly young. I'm going to the nation's capital, and I land at Dulles Airport. And on the way into town, I'm seeing every corporate logo you could possibly imagine. I mean, I'm seeing Citrix, I'm seeing IBM, I'm seeing Dell, and I'm saying, what is this? So I quickly reached the realization this isn't government, this is corporations who are running the government. And it's more true today than ever. I mean, if they see a law they don't like, they simply get it changed. I mean, the whole system of lobbying and campaign financing, it's just all fraudulent. It's all a scam. The people will have a vote, yes, but then the politicians are controlled by the money. And
Mm,
it's apparent. I mean, why is everybody in Washington doing their bidding and getting their way, by the way, getting their way?
yeah. I think maybe they've just become too big, haven't they? And you can have antitrust laws, you can have anti-monopoly laws, and they don't seem like they are doing much. The one thing I will say is that I remember hearing about the EU forcing Apple to change all their things to
Yes.
USB-C, because it just everyone's using them now. It's easier for the consumer. So maybe there are instances in which powerful nations and groups can, make companies sort of bend to their whim, but then I don't know. There's probably also a motivation for them to be like, do what I say, and then maybe USB-C chargers went through the roof in pricing. But everyone's doing something to try and up one of the other person, aren't they?
Yes, yes, yes. And it's capitalism here in America drives everything. And you go from healthcare to insurance, everything you do, it's all capital driven. And that's reaching a breaking point in America as well. We can't continue like this. There's going to have to be a major change. I live here in Florida where people can no longer afford to live. People who are on fixed incomes are being priced out of their homes by taxes and insurance. This can't continue. This may have been a good way to develop a country, this form of capitalism, but it's going to bring it down if it's not fixed.
Yeah, I have quite a few conversations with my cousin about politics, and capitalism, and it's yeah, every time we sort of come to a point of like we don't even know what the solution is. But you're right, something does need to change because I think the status quo can't keep going on. We can't keep going on as business as usual because yeah, you're right, it's helped us get to this point. But now that we're here, we need something that personally for me, we need a system that can blend the best of helping people and actually being kind to people and realizing that without the people, you don't have your society, you don't have your money. So let's find a way to treat people good and to support those that most need it. But at the same time, I don't know, can you have kindness and goodness with capitalism? Is that even possible? Can the two coexist? Is that even a thing? Is that incoherent? Does that not work? I don't know. I genuinely don't know.
No, no, I think it does. And I think that there's some examples around the world we can look at. I mean, just take an example of Japan. It's a little island, and look what they've done. If you've ever been to that place, you will find that they are the nicest people in the world. Their culture is to be polite. Their culture is to help one another. Now, we talked about the automobile industry earlier. What's coming from Japan? Honda, right? Nissan, name a couple of others. These are Japanese
They've
cars.
got all the camera companies. My Fuji
Oh,
comes from
yep, yep,
there.
exactly. This
They
little
make
island,
yeah.
yeah, it's next to nothing. I mean, I don't know how many million people are there, but it's very small. All the population's in Tokyo, so they're producing all these automobiles. coming out of there, and they're shipping them all over the world. And they're still the kindest people in the world, and they prospered. Their population's aging a little bit now, and they have to come up with a solution because they don't let anybody come in there. They're
No,
pretty much closed to the nation. So but I've been saying this because maybe we need to take some hints from what they do with their culture and the way they treat people. If you go to Dubai, the same thing. I mean, there's no crime. How is that possible? Very little crime, very few problems. How is that possible? So, from these elements, perhaps we need to take some hints and apply them to our society because we're losing it. I mean, people don't realize it. They think everything's isolated to America, but when you travel, you find out that people watch CNN just like we do. They
yeah,
see the school shooting. They see that. They see the violence in the street. They see the division in America, and they take note. I had a woman tell me once that, I told my daughter, after she finishes college, she should go to America. And she did. Now I'm telling her to come back. So, so things are changing.
quickly. Yeah, it's
Things are
crazy.
changing. Yeah.
And that's, you know what, that's, I don't know. Like I've always sort of said, oh, I don't know whether personally, I'd want to move countries. Like I love England, don't get me wrong. There's so many great benefits
Mhm.
to it. Um, but at the same time, like one, I can't keep doing the cold. And I love a bit of sun. But also at the same time, the outlook of the UK looks quite grim at the moment.
Yes.
And I don't know how they're going to improve that. I am looking forward to a new government potentially in this year. I don't know what they're going to be able to do to pull the UK out of it. But if they do, then it's going to be a place which can thrive really well. But I think right now we need leaders that can, one, inspire hope, but also that can be brave and that can be bold and that can try new things and that can be open to trying new things. And I'm just not sure. I don't see any world leader that is being able to do that, really.
Well, here's something to think about in retrospect. And even in writing the book, I said, well, this is the way it was, and this is the way it is now. So things do change.
Mm,
So what is not going to change about America? America has to change too. The world's changing. Our position changes. We see other companies, Southeast Asia, for example, and China, who've come from nothing to something. So maybe it's just our time to step aside, and maybe it's somebody else's time to come up, because that's what we see around the world. We see all this activity in other countries that we used to do, building Hoover dams and Golden Gate bridges. Now it's happening in China. So maybe it's their time, and we've had our time. And that's just the cycle of life. That's the way civilization grows and shrinks and grows again. I think that's what's happening.
maybe it'll be Africa's time soon as well. We hope so.
That too. That too. Yeah, that's definitely on the table. No
Yeah.
question.
I think
India.
also with these places as well, I think India's got the highest population now and has got all the people, all the young people, like their doctors there struggle for jobs because there's so
Mhm.
many people that are out there. So, like I said, these are the places which have got the space, which have got the people. It's just now about the resources. So maybe you're right. Maybe the change is coming for a new world powers to see what they can do with the world.
And don't
Um,
leave this element out. Don't leave out the work ethic element.
mm,
Because going back to Detroit, that's how that city was built. Work ethic. People getting up every day at 5 o'clock, working, working, working. You go overseas now, especially in Southeast Asia, they are doing what we used to do, but they're doing it even harder. So instead of one job, they've got two. They've got 3 o'clock in the morning rush hour. They don't seem to rest. They love their leadership. They're doing it for their family and their country. We don't have that here. That makes a big, big difference when you want to do something because you're dedicated to in the case of China, your lifetime leader, and you want to see the
mm,
country improve. That makes a big difference. Our dedication in America is to ourselves, and that's a house divided.
yeah. Um, in terms of your writing, and I'm sure you've definitely got more books planned, or want to do more books. I don't know. Um, but I wanted to know sort of what legacy do you want your books to have on people, and I guess also helping them with a perspective on societal issues.
Yeah, not to just believe what you hear, but to think. And this is becoming more of a difficult task for people because they can Google instead of using their brain, and their brain gets rusty. So I want people to start using their brain again. Because if you Google it, you're going to get what somebody else wants you to believe. You need to be able to research and investigate things. And I'm hoping that's a lesson taught in this book. I don't think people think of, for example, Washington, D.C. and then think slaveholder.
I would
They
have
just
never. No,
don't.
I didn't think of that either myself. Like, and
What
you know,
But you're not supposed to. And that's
mm,
the whole cycle of miseducating us to not think that way. And that means they get away with it without a consequence. So that's what I want people to think about, with them to look at things, even when they spend that $20 bill, who's this guy and who was he? And just the knowledge changes the way you act. Just because you know now, you act differently, you carry yourself differently. That's what I hope will come out of this, a different form of people thinking about history and not believing what's taught in school, questioning their teachers and their teachings.
yeah, and I definitely hope we have the systems that allow for kids to question their teach. Like I know in England, our education is quite Victorian still, and that there isn't sort of room for debate and to argue, okay, was this right? Was this wrong? Or what actually happened here? Um, and even just like, even for our most recent leaders, like, don't get me wrong, like I often say George Bush was a war criminal. Um,
Mhm.
I also say Tony Blair was also a war criminal. What they did in Iraq and Iran was awful. Um, but also, I don't get me wrong, man. I love Obama, but he had loads of drone strikes in Syria, which, probably
Yes,
killed a lot of
yes,
innocent people. Like
yes.
we need to be able to look at these leaders. We need to be able to look at ourselves, look at our own history, and actually have a critical view of that. Because yeah, my love for Obama could blind me to not realizing that, oh. And when Trump
Yep.
said it, it makes it sound a little less valid, but he's not wrong. He's not
Yeah.
wrong on that point. But it's yeah, I'm glad that sort of in your mission because it's gonna get even harder now to figure out what is the truth and what's not the truth. AI,
What you just said is sort of the remarkable thing that should come easy, but it's looking at both sides, being able to be critical and honest on both sides of it. You mentioned Obama. That's just being honest. And see, that's what's missing. You said you could have been blind by it, but you're not, because it's reality. This is what happened. Let's face it. He did these 10 things good, these 4 things bad. Don't take a side. Take a side with the truth. And that's what we're sort of after, to get people to think that way, siding with the truth and not a political party or a viewpoint or a right or a left, but remain, looking down from above and saying, okay, I'm analyzing this, I'm thinking about it instead of reacting to it. So often I hear people quote the same thing I heard on the news yesterday, and they're quoting it.
mm,
They're using the same slogans that they heard on the news. So whatever Trump makes up today, they're going to say it tomorrow.
yeah, and yes, it it is an interesting one, definitely. And I think being able to look at that, and you know what, we take it for granted that we're able to sometimes look at things and be critical about them. And sometimes that's down to education, sometimes it's down to your upbringing. Um, but I do hope, and I'm glad that there are people out there like you that are wanting to, for anybody, that you can critically think about something. And like I was saying, I watch Snowfall. Someone could watch Snowfall and be like, "Yo, was that actually true? What they did in the States?" And then look it up, and they're like, "Yo, whoa! Like they actually brought crack into the hood." That when people say that, it's actually real. So
Yes, yeah.
things like that as well, I think, are helping shape what is truth and allowing you to at least even think, "Oh, let me go and search that up and figure out
There
for
you
myself."
go. Right. Yes. And what we did also in the book, we didn't just leave it to chance. We placed research links to verify everything we're saying. So, when we say that drugs came into the country, we tell who the airlines were. We tell the names of the companies. There's an interview in the book where these pilots talk about how the CIA helped them. It was a CBS interview back in the day. They said they helped us do this. Here's how they did it. It was Air Force bases. It was this and that. CIA denies everything,
Of course
because
they
once
do.
you get caught, they're hands off. They say, "Oh, we don't know you. See you. You're busted." But then they confess to it. We have the names of the airlines that bought this stuff in, who they had contracts with. So it's undeniable. the government can lie all they want, but the truth is the truth. This stuff did not get here by mistake, nor did some street retail level drug dealer bring it in either. He got it from somebody, and that person got it from somebody. And it goes right back to Colombia and the poppy fields. It's all there. This is what I've exposed in the book is nothing new. It's just a bunch of puzzle pieces, and I put them together to where they can see the picture.
Yeah. And it helps, doesn't it? Because yeah, as you're saying, there's the pieces which is like, oh, and even think about that, like the interviews that you would have had with the airlines, and they're like, yeah, the CIA helped us do this. And of course, the CIA won't admit to it. Why would they?
Yep.
They might admit to
Right.
it 70 years time when they release the paper, which is highly redacted, and it's like this
Yes.
happened here and that, you know. But we all know, we all have a sense of something was up. And even I keep mentioning Snowfall, but that was used to fund the Vietnam War as well. So then there's also a
Yes.
war in which probably was a little sketchy in itself. So
Yes.
it's also sometimes it's to fund things which aren't even righteous. And I guess it also questions it, like I don't know where I remember hearing this, but I remember hearing that like some people that went to the Iraq war like really questioned themselves because they were like, yo, I had brothers die on the field for something that was meaningless, for something that wasn't even, it was all built on a lie. And that
Yes.
can have a deep, profound impact on somebody. And even I was talking to someone, the other person I was talking to about the Detroit riots, he was saying his dad was impacted by Agent Orange. That's something
Yes.
in which, you know, they potentially didn't even need to do the Vietnam War. But the result of it then led to impacts on people for generations.
Yep. And by the way, speaking of Agent Orange, those people weren't compensated properly for that damage to their lives. They're just hoping they die off, and there won't be any cases. That's what's happening. I got a good best friend of mine, Agent Orange, dead, never compensated. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so before we end, I've loved this whole episode, and I've loved this chat that we've had. And I always ask all my guests, say if there's a young person that's listening to this conversation, how can something that you know help them with an understanding of themselves?
Yeah. So I would always advise people to seek the truth, think for yourself, be an independent thinker. Don't join a party. Join the truth because it's out there, even though nobody wants to hear it. Create controversy, ask questions always, and never accept the answers. Always investigate them. That's the best advice I'd give young people. And that comes from a lifetime myself of just being a rebel, just not accepting things, even going to church. They almost put me out because I had questions. And you should have questions. And if you don't, you'll never find the truth. So questions and debate, you think about it, look at our history. This whole country, America, was built on debate. You take that away, you've got nothing. So don't be afraid to raise the hard questions because they need to be answered.
Bro. So Christopher, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast. Where can people find you? Where can people find your book? Plug yourself, plug yourself, plug yourself.
Okay, Amazon UK, the book's available now. It's in its second print. Also, you can visit me on my website, www.killingdetroit.com. You can see your interview, for example, is going to be posted there, as well as other events that we have planned during Black History Month here in America. So we'll be doing a rollout. Actually, our book is introduced during Black History Month in February in the US. That's our rollout date. But it's available now on Amazon UK.
Bro, no, so thank you very much. And yeah, Black History Month in the US. I hope it goes well. I'm sure it'll be interesting. There's always some interesting stuff that comes out of Black History Month, isn't there?
Yes. Yes.
So yeah, so I hope it goes brilliantly. But yeah, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast. And I hope you
And
have a
thank you
good
very
day.
much for your time as well. Thank you.
No, it's bro. Thank you very much.